Okay, welcome to Chapter 5. So with all the information we've unlocked so far, we can now dip our toes into color palettes. Palettes can pave the way to a truly artistic expression of color. In this chapter, we'll gain insight into how color choices can affect the mood of your paintings, an understanding of common palettes you can use time and time again, some guidance as to how to structure your colors within any given palette you'd like to use, a further understanding into how colors appear different within different contexts, and the all-important link between choosing a palette with setting the lighting of your environment or painting. I think there's no better way of seeing the power of color palettes than by looking at color key art. Color keys are very small paintings, often rendered without any detail. They simply exist to communicate the overall mood of the scene. And that's what a color palette does. It informs the mood. Now, it does not fully dictate the mood. The mood is created by several factors. For example, the subject matter, the way you light it, the way you compose it, and of course the color palette as well. All of those things contribute to the overall mood. The color palette is there to, let's say, enhance the mood. When all your other elements are in place, for example, your value structure, your composition, the color palette can really be a powerful tool in suggesting to the viewer how they should feel when looking at a certain painting. These are two color keys by Paul Dessain for the film Lord of the Rings. And they both use a very common palette called a monochromatic palette. A monochromatic palette is characterized simply by all the colors in the painting resulting from a single hue. And because it's just a single hue, it's always obvious which color a monochromatic palette is based on. Now, let me show you what a monochromatic palette is not. If I took one of these paintings here, converted it to grayscale, and then added a photo filter on top to bring back in some color, I suppose this technically is monochromatic, but this is not a good example of what a monochromatic palette can do. This to me is grayscale with a desperate attempt at color on top. And that's because when I sample the colors here, you notice that they all seem locked to the same level of saturation. It's like there's an invisible wall there. The color temperature isn't changing, which essentially means it's a glorified grayscale. If we bring back the original painting there at the top, we can really see those temperature changes. And what's really magic about a monochromatic palette is that it's easy to give the illusion that there are other colors in the painting. For example, the rocks in this area, they look very earth tony, don't they? Almost like a raw umber or something. Those colors really read as warm. But if I sample that area and remove that swatch from the painting, they are indeed blue, just a desaturated blue, which, as you remember from the complementary palette example in Chapter 1, means that that color is moving. In this case, against the more saturated blue here, that lesser saturated blue looks so much warmer. Warmer because it's going toward gray, which effectively means it's going toward the warm side of the color wheel. Our eye registers that movement and therefore reads it as warm in this context. And this is precisely how you can have warm and cool colors even if your entire palette is based on blue. I'll try this myself, where I take the same scene, but instead of using a blue monochromatic palette, I'll use this red monochromatic palette. The first thing I'm doing is starting with a very intense red, and now as I adjust the color temperature, look what I'm doing with the saturation, decreasing it, right? Moving it toward gray. You can start augmenting that red. Essentially, the grayer you go, the more it'll start looking cooler. Now, the maximum coldness I can get with this palette is 100% gray, so what I like to do is reserve that for a little later in the painting when I know where I might want to use that. You know, it's kind of like I don't want to play my full hand just yet. Keep a few cards close to the chest. But a color key goes quick. I've established my overall gradient. The hottest red is in the background, and then as we go to the foreground, it's going to get colder and colder red. So I'm confident now in decreasing that saturation, like I'm doing here, and blocking in some of these truly colder reds. And you can see where I'm at in the saturation spectrum. I'm near gray. Right now I'm almost perfectly gray. And you can see that that red is looking bluish. It'll never look blue, just bluish. Or again, the best way of saying that is it'll look like there are warms and cools. It doesn't matter what the colors are. The reason you'd use a monochromatic palette is if you want to use the emotional flavor of a color. Now, I don't adhere to any particular science behind this, but generally red is associated with fire or drama or danger. This key I'm doing right now certainly does feel dramatic to me. Even though it's just a babbling brook, it feels like something's about to happen here. The color just seems to portend some kind of future event. So, if you're telling a story where that fits the narrative, then maybe a monochromatic red color palette like this is exactly what you need. Maybe this palette would not work so well for an opening of Anne of Green Gables. On a technical note, one thing I notice with monochromatic palettes is that the most temperature change seems to happen in the darker values. Like if you look at the foreground, I really get a sense for warm and cool reds in those dark shadows in the foreground. You know, those are dark values there. In the background, where the values of the piece are much lighter, going gray there with those light values definitely does add warm versus cool. Just according to me, it doesn't seem like it adds quite as much when the values are lighter. The cooler reds here seem to come out the most in the darker values. And likewise, if this were a blue monochromatic painting, the warmer blues would come out the most in the darker blues. Now, I'll be totally honest, I can't explain why that is. It's just something I notice visually. And I encourage you to conduct some experiments like this and see if you reach the same conclusions. The other piece of advice I have when painting in a monochromatic palette is make sure you have some kind of temperature variation all over the picture. You can have an overall plan. For example, in this piece, there is more temperature variation in the foreground versus the background. However, if you look at the background, you can see I've still peppered in just a few of those cooler reds back there. This just ensures that the piece never gets stagnant. That is, the color stops moving. You almost never want that. So here's my red monochromatic palette study. This canvas was kept very small, by the way, which is par for the course with color keys, and it's something I really encourage to let you focus on the literal broad strokes. Okay, the next palette we want to talk about, if we just used one color there for a monochromatic palette, let's expand our horizons and use 2 or 3 colors. Now, in chapter 1, we looked at a complementary palette, which uses 2 colors opposite each other on the color wheel. This time, however, let's keep our colors next door to each other. This is called an analogous palette. Analogous palette simply means that the colors used are next to each other on the color wheel. Now, the neighboring colors you pick can be anywhere on the color wheel. They can transition from blues to purples, or reds to yellows, but I do recommend keeping it to a small slice of the color wheel. Here's Norman Rockwell using an analogous palette. What I love about this painting is Rockwell announces the 2 extremes of his palette. There's this saturated yellow for the sky, and this saturated red for the bandanas. Every color in the painting fits within those extremes. Now, their clothing looks pretty green, which would be beyond the yellow, but upon sampling it, it's actually just a slightly lesser saturated orange. This is one of those things that's not at all intuitive. The perceived identity of a color can change depending on the context it's in, and the palettes we're talking about are that context. For instance, back here, that blue looked warm, remember? But if I bring that blue into this painting, it's freezing cold. That's because I've removed it from its context. So on the topic of contexts, I want to show you something that happens specifically with high saturation. I've got this very high saturated bright yellow. I'm just going to paint it in this canvas here, right? Something happens when you have a very bright saturated color on your canvas to start with. I've kind of overloaded the yellow right away. I can't really get any more yellow than this, right? So the second I back this off, even slightly grayer, and I put this in, see, that color should look yellow because after all, it is still quite yellow. But against what is completely loud yellow, this looks like something else. This almost looks greenish, or maybe grayer than it actually is, or more like an umber or earthy color, even though it's quite a saturated yellow. So it's like a bright saturated color skews the color conversation so much that it magnifies the changes of other colors. For example, if I move this color picker just slightly down toward the red and say gray it off a little bit, that's a pretty bright orange. I put it down though, it looks pinkish. If I move to something truly pink like this up here maybe, gray it off even a bit more, look at this, it looks purple. And the reason that happens is because we're comparing it against that super loud yellow. So again, this is to show you the impact of context. With this in mind, let's start the next exercise. Because the goal of our study is to quickly capture color, I don't mind starting out by tracing the drawing, and I just have Photoshop do this for me. I'll duplicate the layer, go up to Filter, Stylize, Find Edges, and Photoshop gives me a line drawing. And here what I'll do is Control-A, Control-C, open a new canvas, paste it in there, and resize that canvas. This is way too big for a color key or a palette study. Let's bring it down to 700 pixels tall. Hit OK. And now what I can do is just desaturate those colors because I don't need them to be blue or anything, and switch the layer to multiply. And now on a layer underneath, I can just begin painting. Then of course with the reference, I'll get rid of my line drawing and just place it beside my study. Okay, so my layer window is off screen because I'm only going to be painting on one layer. The first thing I'm going to do is block in that extremely saturated bright yellow, which will provide that context like we just saw for every other color to relate to. There's a bit of a bright orange transition here too. Now, when colors are neighboring like this, you can really be generous with keeping saturation. There's no need to link them through gray. They're linked via them being neighbors on the color wheel. So I'll just not even think about saturation, just keep the same saturation and put this orangey thing here, maybe a little bit redder as we go. I'm aware that I can go all the way down to about this red here. My range is, limited to about that in this analogous palette. By the way, when you do this find edges thing, Photoshop gives you this annoying sort of noise to the painting, to the line drawing. So sometimes I'll just hop into the layers window, push Control L for levels, and just kind of get rid of some of this. You don't need fidelity in the line drawing. Like, I can lose a lot of this information. It doesn't matter. I'll be painting over it anyway. So something like that. Then I'll get back to the background and continue working. Okay, so what do we want to do here? Well, remembering that values are really a big part of painting, I need to get in some basic silhouette stuff. And I think an obvious one would be this giant rock. Now, looking at that, and I'm being honest with you here, I don't know what color that is. I have to discover it. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be at the yellow extreme, probably going to be somewhere in the middle, and probably, obviously darker, and something maybe a bit more desaturated, maybe something there. And again, that color is pretty saturated that I'm painting with, but it looks fairly desaturated next to those very saturated yellows and reds. I need to start relating these colors together. Remember the whole thing about context. Right now, I barely have any context to work with. I'm building it as I go, and then I can start evaluating. So for example, against this, now maybe I can try and get their skin tones, which to me look possibly a bit more on the orangey side, and obviously lighter, maybe a bit less saturated, maybe something like that. Nope, that's too pinkish. And I should have expected that with the demonstration I just showed you a minute ago. The more experience you get with color, the more you're able to predict how certain colors will look, but it's impossible to have a mental catalog of every color relationship. There's just millions of possibilities, right? The thing you want to be able to do is adjust. To me, that's too pinkish, which is noted. I can maybe use that later, but I want to move away from pink, so I'll go back toward the yellow, maybe add some saturation, and maybe something like this is better. I think this is closer, and I can probably start here. And by the way, I do not feel the need to draw hands or draw correct arms or anything like that. Let's go a bit darker with this and get the silhouettes here. Now the flesh tone against the sky is looking way too gray. Even though it's not gray at all, it's only there. Look how gray it looks in the painting. So I'm gonna make it a bit redder because I see it a bit redder in the painting. Saturate it up a bit, something like this. And then once I have that, I can maybe sprinkle that in to the existing flesh tones here and come a little bit closer to the Rockwell painting. But more importantly, I'm starting to harmonize these colors because I'm having one color sort of show up in surrounding areas. Analogous palettes, or limited palettes in general, are very good for this because you only have a few colors to choose from. So inevitably you'll be sharing colors throughout the painting. That creates color harmony. So the clothes are that lesser saturated orange, as I've established. That's a bit too light. Let's go a bit darker, even a bit darker than that. And it's amazing how that looks green. I can test this. Like, what are the parameters of this green? Like, how about if I made it more reddish? Does that still look green? No, that starts looking red. So undo that. Go back to where I was. How about if I pushed it more yellow? What does that look like? That looks even greener. Look at that. A slightly less saturated yellow looks green, which makes sense because, yellow is closer to green than the orange is. I could also, I've got my two different greens here. I could always sample this one, press lightly on my tablet, and sample the result. In that way, I'm kind of mixing color on the canvas, just like an oil painter might mix colors on their palette. I do use the undo button when I paint, but I very rarely am attached to it. Like, I only undo if I don't like the shape I'm making. I rarely undo if I don't like a color choice. In fact, I almost encourage colors to be quote-unquote wrong, because then you can just paint over them. And when you paint over colors, you create all these interesting and unexpected contexts with it. All right, so I've sped up the video just a little bit here, and I'm filling in all the colors that go there. I'm not choosing really any new colors. I'm just sampling the clothing decisions I've already arrived at, putting it there. If a value appears to need darkening, I'll just darken it down without really thinking about the color change too much. This value here on his clothes needed lightening a little bit, the silhouette from the rock. It reads lighter over the darker rock, so I raised the value a little bit. Their hair obviously gets darker, and I am adding a little red to the hair to make it appear more brownish, knowing that I have a little bit more of an extreme red to get to for the bandanas, which I'm doing right here. So I'm basically, now I have laid in the two extremes of my analogous palette, which is something I do recommend when you have an analogous palette and you know what your two extremes are, which you should have an idea of going into it. Try and get those extremes on the canvas as soon as you can. In addition to the extremes, try and get a few intermediary colors like their clothing and the rock there. That way you start establishing a visual idea of what your color context is doing. You know, what reads as flesh in this context, what reads as dark green clothing, what reads as hair, etc. Now at this point of the painting, I'll just completely delete the line drawing, just get rid of it. You do not need to be literal with these, and I'll just keep working from here. For example, that rock needs to be darker. So instead of me like fumbling around and picking a color and trying it, I'll just do something like this. I got a brush here that's set to multiply mode. This brush comes with my brush pack included in this course, but it's just a regular default round brush with wet edges turned on, set to multiply mode. The rock looks redder, so I'll drag it down to the red, and this is a multiply brush, so I'll pick a lighter color, and I'll just put this brush to work, maybe a little bit darker than that, and darken down this rock toward red. I don't even really care what the resulting color is, I'm just evaluating it visually. That is to say, I don't care what pixel it is, I'm looking at it visually. It needs to be even darker here where the planes of the rock turn under, so I'll block that in. And I don't care about exact drawing anymore. Like, I'm certainly not going to try and copy all the little nooks and crannies of this rock face. It doesn't matter. That would matter if I were doing an actual final painting, but not in a color palette study. You notice I don't even have the dog blocked in yet, but he's going to be light over the dark stuff here, so establishing these darks will serve two purposes. I could also, with my same multiply brush, maybe go up to a yellow and, you know, glaze some of this color into the rock. I know it'll work in context because I'm within my analogous palette. Again, that's the nice part about limited palettes. It's less chance for you to screw up because you only have so many choices. Color harmony is generally established when you have similar hues that show up in different saturations throughout the painting. So working with a limited palette, like this analogous palette here, is going to be easier for you because the hues are already predetermined. It's much easier to have them harmonized when you're only dealing with a few. And this is all just with my multiply brush. I noticed there's darker values there. I can experiment with darker reds. Maybe I'll even go all the way down to my extreme red here and start adding that as like a dark. Maybe like under his face. His hat can go a bit darker. The nice thing about the multiply brush is it keeps the integrity of the color you already have there. So, you know, I could like pitch the whole painting a bit redder like that. And look, it works. It's just a little bit redder, but within the same relationships I've already established. So I do like painting on multiply mode. That's no doubt influenced by my watercolor training. If any of you have ever used watercolor, you know it's basically like painting on a multiply layer in digital. That is, the colors you put down make the paper constantly darker, and they tint it toward a color. So by way of adding these different colors by multiply mode, I'm also expanding my palette kind of out to fill the extremes that I've already established. His arm needs to go darker here. I'll just stay on multiply mode and just sort of get this in. A little shadow under the hat. Maybe back off the red, get an intermediary orange there, sort of in the middle of my two extremes, and darken down his chest, under the sleeve. And what's so important here, the thing I want to stress, is I'm not particular about which color I'm picking, not nearly as much as I'm obsessing over just visually evaluating how it looks on the painting. I think too many digital painters get caught up in the fact that you can pick each individual color. And I know from my own teaching experience, I get a lot of questions from students saying, like, how do you know what color to pick? And while that's a fair question, I'm encouraging you to reframe it here. You are always more interested in contexts. So, you know, learning about these palettes will give you a nice starting point as to which context you might be working in. You know, setting your two color extremes in this case and working within them. We did the same thing with Chapter 1's complementary palette. We had our extremes in mind. In that case, they were opposites on the color wheel, and we worked within them, filling in the blanks. This is no different. It's just my extremes are different. So let me take a quick pause from the painting and expand on that. When we were working in our complementary palette, say this versus that, we had those two extremes and we filled in the blanks. But in that case, the blanks was not all these hues. The blank was going through gray and back out to purple, right? That was the filling in of the blank. In this painting, it's more of a hue thing, filling in the hues from here to here. Now, so far, we haven't really been too adventurous with grays. And indeed, even the Rockwell painting, there aren't too many super grays in there. But watch what we can do. Let's say I'm looking at this rock and I'm like, it's reading overall brown. I want that color to move more. Well, so long as I'm in my hues here, I could always gray this off and treat it like the monochromatic palette, where I'll just grab a brush and, I can put in this much cooler orangey red, whatever color this is, and, it starts looking bluish. Now, the Rockwell painting doesn't really have that. Well, it kind of does, but it's just darker. It's kind of got these little almost cooler passages here that I can start finding now with using grays within my analogous colors. So this is like the monochromatic palette. It's just expanded because I have more hues to access. But within any of those hues, I have full rights to go into these grays and see what they can do for me. I can do this with anything. I can pick the clothing, right? Say, okay, it's there. Let's see what happens if I really gray this off and therefore cool it. And look at that. It looks like there's a blue skylight shining down. It's not really in the Rockwell painting. He has restrained himself from using that. But first of all, this works because it's in context. It's within my palette. I might want to use it. And feel free when you're doing these color key studies, by the way, to, experiment beyond what the original is doing. Rockwell is a fantastic painter, but this is just the choices he made in this painting. This is not to say that you can't experiment with other potential options. In fact, it's encouraged that you do, because then you can understand not only what Rockwell is doing here, or, the artist you're studying, but also what else may have been possible for that piece. I really love digging into artists, sketchbooks, their studies for paintings, because often they do explore different options for color palettes. That's a big one artists like to explore, is different options for color palettes. And quite often you see fully different treatments for paintings. So right here, like his brim of his hat has this little rose peachy tone on it. Let's see if I can find that. It's a cooler red, cooler because it's going toward gray. And you can just start hitting top planes, maybe planes that face up with this cooler red while I'm here. I wonder how it even looks in the flesh. That's too dark. If I lighten it up, this is interesting. It's starting to deviate a little bit from the original, which is okay, again, but let's maybe keep it a bit more honest in this case, just for demonstration purposes. But again, fully encouraged to go beyond or, try something other than what the artist is doing, maybe inspired by the artist, The plane of the hand turns there. You can really see that this painting is coming together. If I wanted to put in some texture on this rock, I can get like a little dotted brush and just sort of scatter in some texture and then have, that inspire me to, whoops, can't get that color. I'm so used to painting with full palettes that I just automatically go to the opposite. But no, let's restrain it back in here. That rock that was once maybe too brown is now starting to have some nice variety to it. And of course, to prevent myself from doing too much variety, I can bring myself right back into those warmer red/oranges and just build that color back in. So with color, it's always like a push and pull type of game. Push it around, pull it around, introduce some grays, bring back some warms, introduce some more cools, and just keep pushing and pulling it until you have a nice statement. And by that, I mean some nice variety to it, some maybe unexpected variety. Here's where the sky is coming down and just hitting these little top planes of the rock. And this is a nice little exercise in varieties of mark making and shape and just trying to make non-repetitive marks here that good artists are so good at. That's a design thing, though. This class is not really about design. It's about color design, I suppose, but not necessarily like compositional design. That's a whole other topic. Art has so many subtopics that they all connect via the same principles, but they do deserve to be studied separately, which is why I try and isolate my classes into kind of dealing with fundamentals separately. The highlights can be just anything in the yellows, really, because a highlight is a reflection of the light source, so the little highlight on his knee is reflecting the light source, which is the yellow sky. I guess that's important to note here. There's no direct light on these characters. In essence, there is no bully light here. There is only this soft ambient light coming down from the sky. And because that sky is so yellow and orange, that explains the utility of this palette. If the sky is the light source and the sky is this brilliant yellow-orange, might as well make all the other colors in the painting, neighbors of that. Now, in terms of the mood that we're getting out of this, That's very abstract, and I don't want to be here saying like, oh, yellows equals happiness and childhood, and reds equals fire and fury, even though I suggested that before. Red is a pretty common one too that we associate with certain moods, but not every color has that. You know, when I'm painting, kind of the last thing I'm thinking of is like what mood a certain color is associated with. I just try and feel it myself, like just feel it in your bones. It's one of those artsy fartsy things that it's not really quantifiable. Like I once had a client I was doing a background painting for some animated show, and I painted the walls like this muted lime green, which looked good to me. But the client came back and said the color was depressing. That was the word that he used, was depressing. And it dawned on me then, this is back in like 2004, one of my first ever jobs. And dawned on me then like, oh, you know, people have their own personal associations with color that may not be the same ones that I have. And that's true with any color in the spectrum. So I think it's helpful when painting to give yourself as many options as you can as you're exploring these color keys. That is, do one like this with an analogous palette of, you know, yellows to reds. Try the same thing where it's pitched. Like maybe you're going to go from orange up to like the intro of green here. Maybe try one over here where it's like blues to turquoise or something. And we'll definitely play with that upcoming in this chapter. The same scene in two different keys. We'll try that as another exercise. As for now, though, this painting is looking good. We're almost done with this study. In fact, I might just speed it up, which I've just started to do. And I'll just talk about what's going on for the remaining 4 minutes of this. The first thing I want to point out is don't feel the need to render faces or anything like that. Anything detailed like hands or faces or dog hair. Ignore all that. Just block it in as like big planes, big blocks. You notice the main character there, it looks like he's got like just a flat face. I'll put a suggestion of some planes of the head in there, but nothing much. You try and capture perspective, I guess. Here comes the dog, by the way. Let's look how simply this is going to be painted. Mostly I'm just trying to capture the contrast of that dog, light over dark. The dog is light over the dark rock. And the boy who's holding the dog has some light colored flesh over the dark rock. And, you know, if it looks anything remotely like a dog, that's fine. It doesn't have to be fully rendered. That's the reason the canvas is so small. It doesn't really let me get in there and fully render things. Here I'm just trying to find maybe some other color accents. When I say accents, I mean like what are the most saturated colors? We started with the yellow, and I've already talked about how the red is equally saturated. Those are your two extremes. But there are some other areas of the painting that have some, you know, some oranges. Look at the straps on their bags. There's some oranges that kind of pop out a bit. And just little things here and there that if you give them that little push in saturation, they'll pop out just that little bit. And you try and use that sparingly, but it is there. I'm just looking at the rock in the study here, and I'm just really enjoying how many tiny little shifts there are in there. And I never really felt like I was ever totally nailing that. I just pushed and pulled it, you know, like I was mentioning before, over the course of several different passes. I didn't try and cover the rock all in one pass. You know, at first it was covered with a generic color, but then over the course of the study, I would pick away at it, adding some grays, bringing back some reds and oranges and darkening it down, whatever. And at this point, now that I've gone over, say, that rock like 4 or 5 times, it actually has a nice little statement of variety to it. There's something about it that looks pleasing. And honestly, I chalk a lot of it up to happy accidents, things I've discovered while painting this scene. No matter how much about color you know, you're always going to be able to surprise yourself with how one color looks in the context of your palette you're working in. I've been doing color professionally since 2004. My very first job was a background painter in 2004. You know, almost 20 years later, I'm still surprised at how some colors look up against other colors. It never ends, which is thrilling. It proves to me that I chose the right career path because I always feel like there's a surprise waiting to be had. Now, even though all this happy accident talk, you have to set yourself up within a framework for your happy accidents to make sense. And that's where palettes come in. Once you have the restraints, you know, the restrictions that palettes impose, that's what palettes do, they limit you. Within that fenced-in framework, you are more likely to stay within a structure, and that's what makes things work, is the structure. That's why generally you never really see artistic breakthroughs in like a kid's drawing, because there's just no structure there. Having a little girl myself, I think children's art is pretty for different reasons, but structure is definitely not one of them. And if your goal is to be a professional artist in the entertainment industry, you know, movies, books, games, etc., really anything you do boils down to structure. It could be gesture drawing, anatomy, perspective, environment design, or color palettes like here. There's a structure behind every art discipline. And alright, here's the result of our analogous palette. It's a nice picture. And just think, you now have a palette that you can try out on any picture you do. Alright, so now that we have an idea of how to operate within limited palettes, let's take a look at some other common limited palettes, and then look at paintings that use them very effectively. Of course, we'll start by looking at the full color wheel, and each of the following palettes is going to limit this color wheel in different ways. You know, maybe we should start with some more examples of analogous palettes. Here's another analogous palette by Paul Lassaigne. Now this one obviously uses a different set of colors. It goes from kind of the warmish yellows to the medium cool greens. And what I like about this, it seems to have a hierarchy, like the light is assigned to the warmer yellows and the shadows, like what's up front, is assigned to the colder greens. So Paul Lassaigne has achieved a very logical system of warm to cool. Another one here by Paul Lassaigne, which uses this range of the color wheel. And of course, he's depicting a literally cold place, so it only makes sense to use colors that we consider to be actually cold, right? Very logical choice. Another one by Dice Susumi. This one uses a larger range of the color wheel, but all the colors are still analogous. They're all still neighbors. Let's go back to the good old complementary palette and take a look at some examples of that. Now, the challenge with a complementary palette is suddenly we're dealing with two opposite spectrums from the color wheel. So what that means is the danger is that we can get overly excited with both opposite ends and kind of push both to the extreme. Usually you don't want to do this. Usually what you want to do is pick a dominant color, like for example, maybe it's the color of the light. Allow that to get saturated, and then in the shadow you're using the complement, but you're using like a grayer version of it. Or just the opposite. You're using the saturated version of the color in the shadow and a more grayed down version in the light. This color key by Bill Cohn is an excellent example. It's using the turquoise side of blue and then the direct opposite of that, which is the red that's on the warm end of the spectrum. And you'll notice the blue is the color that Bill Cohn has allowed to become very saturated. And then by contrast, he doesn't need to use so much of his red. He can keep those reds fairly grayed down, yet they still read as so warm because there is still an extreme gap between these two colors. This one by Paul Lassaigne uses a classic pairing of complementaries, which is the orangey yellows and the purpley blues. This is kind of a classic because the morning sun is categorically that color, and therefore shadows are kind of categorically this purpley blue. So using this is almost a way to guarantee that your color temperatures are going to align with how real life looks. And in this one, similar to the Bill Cohn one, it's the shadows that are being favored. The purples are getting more saturated than the oranges, and it achieves a kind of balance that way. This one by Dominique Louis is the same palette as the Bill Cohn painting, pitting turquoise blues against grayed down reds. And I'm showing you this to point out that the subject matter is completely different, but that doesn't even matter. You can apply these palettes to literally anything. Here's one with the exact same palette again, this one by Nathan Fowkes for Shrek. Of course, we're in nighttime here, and nighttime in film is classically rendered with kind of this deep turquoisey blue. And then you notice for light, it's the opposite side of the color wheel, he's using that red color. And it really achieves the goal of making those warm colors actually feel quite warm and inviting and welcoming as they pop out against those colder blues. You'll notice on this one, both sides of the spectrum are equally saturated, but you'll also notice that to make up for that, Nathan Fowkes has been very selective with where he puts that red. It's only a few spots in the painting. The split complementary palette is just like the complementary palette with one more layer. First you pick your dominant color, but instead of taking the direct complement as your secondary color, you split it and use the two neighbors instead. And the setup I'm showing you right here is ideal for rendering sunlit scenes. This is a split complementary palette. Notice that the sunlit colors are all homogenized to that warm color, and then by contrast the shadows are split in two. In the middle ground and some of the foreground we have a more purpley influence to the shadow, and then in the background we have a more turquoise influence to the shadows. Now I mentioned this palette is useful because it mimics how real life works. You can see in this photo of the Grand Canyon, it's totally true that the shadows in the foreground are more influenced by the purpley side of blue, then in the background it fades to more of the turquoise blue. This painting by Edgar Payne is also a split complementary palette, but it's flipped. There are two colors in the light and only one in the shadow. He's got a yellowy warm for the brighter parts of the light, and then where that rock turns into halftone, he's darkening it and it gets a little redder. Now the shadows are interesting too. It's not just that one blue. Where it goes blue, it's just that one blue. But you'll notice there's a whole lot of reflected light in those shadows, and it's a very warm reflected light. And those reflected lights are derived from grays that could be achieved from those three. So there's a whole symphony of grays in here, which makes this a particularly beautiful painting in my eyes. The last palette I'd like to introduce you to is called the Triadic palette. And again, very simple conceit behind this one. Make a triangle, and whatever three colors the points of the triangle indicate are the colors you use. So something like this, for example. And just like we've seen before, this palette tends to work best when you have a hierarchy of dominance. So you pick your dominant color, then your supporting color, and then the last one you can kind of use as an accent color. And again, the reason we do this kind of balancing is all in the name of structure. So all three colors in this case won't be fighting for equal attention, rather there is a clear hierarchy in play. One of the most popular characters in the world is based on a triadic palette. Superman's costume is primarily blue, red would be a supporting color, and then yellow would be the accent color. So you can see how there's a three-tiered effect. And if you look at this poster artwork here, they keep the triadic palette in balance. Blue is still the most dominant color, as it simply appears the most in the painting, and then red and yellow following in place. Speaking of movie characters, remember in The Matrix when Morpheus tells Neo, "Some rules can be bent, others can be broken." I think the danger when I'm explaining to you guys these palettes is that you might take them too literally and feel like you have to adhere to one of them every time. That's certainly not the case. These palettes are meant to be bent and broken and pushed around. They're great starting points, and certainly you could adhere to them 100%, like many of the examples I've shown you. But take a look at this color key by Dominique Louis from Ratatouille. When I tried to fit this palette into a template, I came up with this. You know, I certainly think this painting is based off a three-color system, but what's the relationship of those three colors? It's not really triadic. It's also not really split complementary. It's somewhere in between the two. And is there a name for this palette? Not that I know of. But what it does, it gives me a yellow, which is the warmest color. It gives me a red that's bordering on violet. And then it gives me an actual violet to round out the cool colors. And in the hands of a skilled artist like Dominique Louis, it's used to excellent effect. And it's as simple as that. There are no rules. I remember back when I painted this one, I wasn't thinking about any specific palette. But I was thinking about limiting color, and I certainly was thinking about having my lights be in this lemony yellow, which in my mind is a cooler yellow because it's closer to green. And then the shadows would be in the turquoise blues. So kind of close together on the color wheel. And I like that pairing because those two colors feel very airy and light to me. And that's the kind of feel I wanted in this illustration. So rendering the light with those colors allowed me to achieve the mood I was after. But then there are many more colors. You can see I'm certainly not skimping on the color wheel here. But in my mind, the other colors are introduced only via two more hues, and it's these two here. The addition of these two allow me to get grays that are on the opposite side of the color wheel. Like if you look at the bridge, you can see some purple grays, reddish grays, there are reds in the grass. These are supporting cast members. So you can see in this painting where there's a whole lot of color being used, and I'm not adhering to any rule. I'm adhering to the principles of structure, you know, organizing my color into hierarchies, like having a dominant color for the light, the yellows, a dominant color for the shadow, the blues, and then the red and the purple will be kept on the grayer side as kind of complements. So over the last couple chapters we've been looking at this painting, let's do a color key study of it.